Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
It had been quite the rough week at the accounting firm where I work. Our team had just finished closing the books for one of our biggest clients, and after 5 straight days of overtime and endless spreadsheets, my co-workers and I decided to treat ourselves to dinner at the local Chipotle. Nothing fancy, just some well-deserved Mexican food to celebrate surviving another hectic quarter end. I've been working at the firm for about 3 years now, and these quarterly celebrations had become something of a tradition for our small team. We'd always go somewhere casual. No one wanted to dress up after spending days hunched over their computers in business casual attire. The line at Chipotle wasn't too bad when we arrived. We got our food and found a nice high table near the window. Perfect spot to unwind and share some laughs about the chaos of the past week. There were 4 of us, myself and 3 other accountants who'd been in the trenches together. We had barely taken 5 bites of our burritos when this couple approached our table. The woman stood there with her arms crossed, staring at us like we'd committed some terrible crime. Her boyfriend was completely absorbed in what looked like a football game on his phone. The woman immediately demanded that we move, claiming it was their spot. I was confused at first, thinking it must be some kind of joke. I mean, who claims ownership of a table at a Chipotle? When I asked her to clarify, she repeated her demand, explaining that this was their table and they sat there every weekend. I looked at my co-workers who seemed just as confused as I was. I politely told her that we had just started eating but offered that she could have the table once we were finished. Her eyes narrowed to slits, and her mouth hung open in shock. She started ranting about how she and her boyfriend had been coming there every weekend for years, emphasizing that they always sat there and demanding we move immediately. By this point, other customers were starting to stare. Her boyfriend hadn't even looked up from his phone. When she realized we weren't going to move, she stormed off to the counter, cutting straight to the front of the line. A few minutes later, she returned with the manager in tow. She complained to him about how rude we were being, insisting that we needed to move so they could have their spot since they were loyal customers. The manager simply told her that he couldn't make us move since we were paying customers who were already eating. She then walked back to our table completely red in the face and ordered us to move once again. One of my co-workers, who usually avoids conflict like the plague, suggested that maybe we should just move to accommodate them. I refused. The woman responded by cursing at all of us, which prompted my other co-worker, who'd been quiet this whole time, to suddenly stand up and tell her to leave us alone. The manager approached again, looking increasingly frustrated. He asked her and her boyfriend to leave since they were causing a scene. When she refused to go anywhere, he warned her that he would call the police. She clearly thought he was bluffing, but 15 minutes later, 2 police cars pulled up outside. When the officers came in and the manager explained the situation, they asked her to step outside to talk. She initially refused, but finally complied when the officers moved closer. Once outside, she completely lost it. She was screaming so loud we could hear her through the windows, though we couldn't make out what she was saying. When one of the officers stepped toward her, she actually slapped him in the neck. Within seconds, she was in handcuffs and being placed in the back of a police car. Her boyfriend finally looked up from his phone, shrugged, and walked out. The manager came back to our table looking shell-shocked. He apologized profusely, saying he'd never seen anything like it in his 15 years of food service. He then offered us free meals the next time we came in. We later found out through a friend who works at the local courthouse that she got charged with assaulting a police officer and disorderly conduct. Apparently, she tried to argue in court that she had squatters' rights to the table because she'd been sitting there every weekend for years. The judge was not amused. My team and I now make it a point to sit at that exact table every time we finish our quarter-end reports. We haven't seen her since, but the manager always gives us a knowing smile when we come in. I recently moved to this neighborhood after getting a promotion at work. Having spent most of my life in apartments, I was excited to finally have my own house with a yard. My daughter's 10th birthday was coming up, and since she's been doing great in school, I decided to get her something special. An American Girl doll she'd been asking for all year. I ordered it well in advance, making sure it would arrive before her birthday party this weekend. The delivery was scheduled for today, but I had to attend an important client meeting that couldn't be rescheduled. I wasn't too worried though, as this neighborhood seemed safe, and packages rarely went missing. Around 1 p.m., while I was wrapping up my meeting, my phone buzzed with an alert from my doorbell camera. I quickly checked it and saw my next-door neighbor picking up my package. We'd exchanged hellos a few times since I moved in 3 months ago, but never really talked beyond that. I figured she was just being neighborly, keeping the package safe until I got back. About 45 minutes later, I returned home and walked over to her house. I rang the doorbell and she answered with a smile. I politely thanked her for picking up my package and keeping it safe. Her smile immediately turned into a confused frown as she denied knowing anything about a package. When I insisted that she had taken one from my porch about an hour ago, she continued to deny it. When I mentioned having video evidence from my doorbell camera, her entire demeanor changed. Her face turned red and she started yelling about being recorded without her consent. She threatened to call her lawyer and slammed the door in my face. I stood there in shock for a moment before my anger took over. I knocked on her door again, much harder this time, and shouted through the door that she needed to return my package or I would call the police. She didn't answer. I went back home fuming and started copying the video file to a flash drive to take to the police station. Before I could finish, there was a knock at my door. 2 police officers were standing there. They explained they had received a call about harassment and unauthorized recording. I couldn't believe she'd actually called the police. I explained the situation and showed them the doorbell camera footage. While we were talking, her husband pulled up in his driveway. The officers went to speak with both of them. Through my window, I could hear her still ranting about being recorded without permission. Her husband looked mortified as he disappeared into their house and came back out with my package, already opened and partially rewrapped with different paper. Her husband was extremely apologetic and begged me not to press charges, trying to downplay the situation. The officers, however, were clear about the seriousness of package theft and filing a false police report. They arrested her right there on her front lawn. Even as they put her in the police car, she continued shouting about her privacy rights being violated. The next day, the neighborhood watch captain stopped by. Apparently, there had been several package thefts in the area over the past year, and my neighbor had been suspected but never caught. My doorbell camera footage led to her confessing to 6 other thefts. The officer who arrested her later told me she had been running a small resale business online, selling items she stole from porches. She's now facing multiple charges of theft and 1 count of filing a false police report. Her husband filed for divorce last week. I installed a package lockbox by my front door, and my daughter loved her American Girl doll. The neighborhood feels a bit safer now, and I've made some good friends with other families on the block who were also victims of her thefts. My younger sister and I have always been close despite our 3-year age gap. When I was 14, she was in her first year of middle school, and that's when this whole mess started. It began with this girl in my sister's class. She was one of those kids who just wouldn't leave others alone. Every single day she'd follow my sister and her best friend around during breaks, lunch, and even after school. At first they tried to be nice about it, but this girl just didn't understand personal boundaries. My sister would politely ask her to leave them alone, explaining that they just wanted to eat their lunch in peace. But the girl would whine and complain, asking why they were being so mean to her. When my sister's friend tried to explain that they simply wanted some space, the girl would threaten to tell everyone they were bullying her. This went on for weeks. The girl would interrupt their conversations, try to force herself into their activities, and even started spreading rumors about them to other students. My sister and her friend tried telling their teachers, but they just got the usual, try to include everyone's speech. Then one day, it all came to a head. The girl was following them around the playground, pulling at their clothes and calling them names. My sister finally snapped and pushed her away. The girl stumbled and fell into the bark-covered ground. She wasn't hurt, the bark is there for exactly that reason, but you'd think my sister had committed a serious crime by the way she ran off crying. Later that day, as my sister and her friend were walking home, a car screeched to a halt beside them. Inside was the girl and her father, and he looked absolutely furious. He yelled at them to stop right there and accused them of bullying his daughter and demanded to know if they thought they could get away with it. My sister and her friend, both only 11 years old, were terrified. They did the only thing they could think of. They ran. They darted across the main road and down a side street where her friend lived. But this grown man, this father in his 30s, wasn't done. He actually drifted his car around the corner, tires squealing, and cut them off right in front of the house. He hung halfway out his window, screaming threats at them. He said he would kick their heads in and kill them both. These threats were being shouted at two 11-year-old girls. My sister managed to call both me and our dad. Being closer but only 14, I couldn't drive, so I started running while calling the police. That's when this amazing bystander, a woman walking her dog, stepped in. She confronted the man, demanding to know what he thought he was doing, threatening children like that. She told him to get back in his car and leave them alone. The father suddenly changed his tune. He wouldn't yell at an adult witness, but he was still fuming. He sped off just as I arrived, followed shortly by our dad and the police. When we gave our statements, the police took it very seriously. They found him quickly. Turns out threatening to kill children is a big deal. A court date was set, and that's when things got even more interesting. This guy actually shaved off his beard, thinking it would make him harder to recognize in court. But the best part was how he completely self-destructed during the hearing. The judge was actually being pretty lenient at first, seemingly buying his story about being a concerned father. Then the bystander took the stand and described exactly what happened. The father jumped up and excitedly agreed with her testimony, specifically pointing out that he hadn't shouted at her. His lawyer literally put his head in his hands at that point. The judge seized on this admission, asking if he was acknowledging his presence at the scene and his threats toward the children. The father went completely silent, realizing what he'd just done. The judge wasn't playing around anymore. This man, in his early 30s, got 6 months in jail and a criminal record. The police later told us he'd have a hard time finding employment, with a conviction for threatening to kill minors. The girl ended up changing schools after that, and we later heard that her parents got divorced. Apparently, this wasn't the first time her father had shown such aggressive behavior. My sister still feels a bit bad about pushing her that day. But as our dad said, while the push wasn't the best response, nothing justifies a grown man threatening to kill children. I never thought my degree in environmental engineering with a focus on water treatment systems would lead me to exposing one of the most entitled people I've ever met. But here we are. While my day job isn't related to my degree, a friend who works for the neighboring city reached out to me about some concerning deaths of waterfowl in a preservation area. They needed someone to investigate the possible water pollution, and since I had the expertise, they offered me a contract to look into it. Armed with my testing equipment and city authorization to access any reasonable location along the preservation area, I began my investigation. After weeks of collecting water and soil samples, I discovered dangerous levels of nitrates and phosphates in the water. The concentrations were so high that they were affecting the local wildlife. I traced the pollution upstream, testing various locations near housing developments and apartment complexes. As I moved further up the river, the pollution levels became increasingly dangerous. We're talking about levels that could seriously harm humans. One day, while following the riverbank, I heard children's voices and splashing. My heart dropped. As I rounded the bend, I saw several kids jumping off a dock into the heavily contaminated water, with a woman watching them from the dock. I quickly approached her and explained that I was working with the city, telling her the children needed to get out of the water immediately because it wasn't safe for swimming. She immediately got defensive, claiming it was private property and that I had no right to be there. I had to explain that this was a public waterway and that I was conducting an official investigation, emphasizing how dangerous the pollution levels were. She still insisted they could use the dock however they wanted since they built it, and that the children were perfectly fine. That's when I told her she could explain all of that to the city marshal, who I was calling right then to have the area barricaded. She gathered the kids and left in a hurry. The marshal arrived shortly after and discovered the dock wasn't up to code. It had to be demolished within a week. The pollution completely disappeared upstream of this neighborhood. After dozens of tests to confirm, it was clear this was the source. Now I just had to figure out why. The marshal and I began interviewing residents about their lawn care practices. That's when things got interesting. The woman from the dock, who turned out to be the president of the neighborhood's homeowners association, started calling the police on us. Eventually, the police dispatcher had to warn her that they'd already explained multiple times that we were city contractors, and if she called again, they'd have to charge her with misuse of emergency services. But she didn't stop there. She followed us around in her car, taking pictures and trying to intimidate us. Finally, an elderly resident gave us the crucial information we needed. He explained how the association president had been fining everyone for having brown grass during the drought. After the city started fining people for excessive watering, she took matters into her own hands. When I asked him to elaborate, he told us how she had tried hiring a landscaper to fertilize everything, but they refused. Then some men showed up with a huge tank trailer and sprayed every inch of grass right down to the riverbank. With the residents' permission, I took soil samples from their yard and the common areas. The results were shocking. They had used restricted agricultural-grade fertilizer that required special licensing to even possess. I compiled all the evidence and submitted it to the city. The case was building up to go to court, but the association president took a plea deal. The fines totaled around $250,000, and the cleanup costs were estimated to exceed $1 million. The entire homeowners association faced dissolution due to their negligence. The association president was also charged with illegally obtaining restricted chemicals. Turns out she had gone through some shady connections to get the fertilizer after legitimate businesses refused to help her maintain her perfect green lawn vision. I heard she's not only lost her position, but she's also facing personal liability for the environmental disaster she caused. And there's an ongoing investigation into her illegal chemical sourcing. The residents are now working to form a new association, one that actually follows environmental regulations and city guidelines. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.